45 minutes into the larger nationwide invasion as a whole, which included this fairly large border battle in the Fort Bliss, El Paso area, the SEAD operations of the three different nations of Russia, China, and even Iran firing their tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles at the American 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade's now deployed units was wrapping up as these various and dispersed Patriot battalions and their subordinate batteries, along with a single THAAD battery remaining at the post, had been largely destroyed. The fighting now raged all throughout the post, from its southern end and the main post to its Biggs Army Airfield, and all the way north to the northernmost training ranges, which were comprised of a host of many live fire training ranges, being that it was adjacent to the White Sands Range. As the American 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division had attempted to break out of the post and head for the nearby Rocky Mountains adjacent to the Las Cruces area, which was itself was a vital road and even rail junction, with two major interstates connecting within the city itself and a railroad running through it. This could never be allowed by the invasion forces, as the Trojan shock armies that began on Allied CCP regime properties purchased by the Chinese, the Pakistani 14th Infantry Division was the local Trojan unit within the area, strategically placed on these properties to aid and facilitate the advance of the external component, whose job itself, as the 14th Group Army and 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade, was to facilitate the Trojans further inland in their operations. While this battle raged inside the city of El Paso and along the border of Mexico and New Mexico itself as well, and all along the installation's perimeters and now beginning to get deep within it, the salient of American forces in the north had to be contained immediately and destroyed. Unfortunately for the Americans in this regard, their forces operating in this area were beginning to mix as these battalions became unwieldy formations in the absence of radio communications due to the Chinese electronic warfare assets jamming these signals operating in this particular region, as well as the tandem cyber and anti-satellite strikes occurring at midnight at the kickoff of the invasion. These forces were now essentially deaf, dumb, and blind and had to rely on word-of-mouth communications passed on by a chain of runners running from element to element as these companies began to break down and even mix together, as these forces were desperately trying to break out of the installation only to be parried and destroyed by the Pakistani Trojan forces, as occurred at the point of the salient in the previous segment of this documentary series. In the north, another of the two divisional artillery battalions of the Pakistani Army's 14th Infantry Division were raining 155 millimeter shells on the northern portions of the salient in support of their armored battalion, as well as their two mechanized infantry battalions operating in the area. The two mechanized infantry battalions being comprised of wheel-based forces in terms of their Al-Fad APCs and IFVs, in terms of their combat vehicles, with the armored battalion being a track-oriented battalion comprised of their Al-Khalid main battle tanks, essentially Chinese designed and built main battle tanks, a copy of their Type 90-2 main battle tank, which was a Type 88C with some minor upgrades, which now was being licensed produced in Pakistan's Taxala Heavy Industries factory as the Al-Khalid 1 by them. These forces of the armored infantry within this battalion were also operating tracked APCs and IFVs in addition to the Al-Khalid tank companies. These vehicles being the Saad APC, which was an American M113 clone, or M113s themselves, as Pakistan had purchased these from America in vast quantities throughout the Cold War, as well as their new Viper infantry fighting vehicles, which had additional applique armor kits or explosive reactive armor kits that could be placed on them for increased survivability, which fired a new 30mm autocannon and Concours missile system with a PKT 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun with the 30mm autocannon. This was being operated by the Terra Combat Module, a Slovakian-designed combat system which operated the 3 different weapon systems aboard, being the Concours ATGMs, which were anti-tank guided missiles, the 30mm autocannon, and 7.62mm coax machine gun. These were very potent infantry fighting vehicles, although the Al-Khalid was the star of the show, so to speak, in proverbial terms, as this battalion, this armored battalion, smashed into the American lines, where in this sector, elements of the Cav battalion, or squadron, essentially, of the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division were beginning to mix with companies of a local armored battalion of the 1st Brigade, as well as units of the Brigade Engineering Battalion mixing with elements of the other armored battalion, mixing with the artillery battery, which had been doing live fire exercises near the point of the salient at a live fire artillery range at the time the battle had broken out. The Mechanized Infantry Battalion was mixing with all of these units as its companies now were widely distributed and dispersed throughout this salient. And the headquarters of headquarters and support battalions tried to stay as best as they could within the middle of all of these forces as they slinkied along slowly and were mixing together due to the difficulties created by a lack of communication. This essentially inadvertently concentrated their forces as well as mixed them together in such a way where force dispersion, as would ordinarily be the case with these armored formations and Cav squadron, would be normally the regular combat conditions. But now, due to the lack of communications, these forces were more concentrated as for ease of communications between runners running orders and vital information back and forth. This caused there to be a much higher rate of casualties than would ordinarily have been the case under ideal conditions, as these concentrated forces were far easier to be picked off and destroyed by the massing of firepower in terms of the Pakistani forces and their Russian air support coming from aircraft of the MiG-31K squadron assigned to this particular area to give them their close air support, as well as just to the south of this salient against the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, where a pair of MiG-31Ks aided the other armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion, which had smashed their way into the post and were attacking the Biggs Army airfield at the time. In the north, the other 10 of the 12 aircraft of the MiG-31K squadron were dispersed all throughout the fighting, hitting the tip of the salient and also the center of the northern portion of the salient, where the armored battalion and artillery were attacking, as well as even to the far east of the salient, where these two Pakistani mechanized infantry battalions were attacking as well. Although in the northern area of the whole salient, the area where the armored battalion was attacking within a 2 by 2 mile area was by far some of the heaviest combat, as this battalion struck an area where 4 different American companies had coalesced. There were 3 American armored companies and a rifle company from the Cav squadron of the American 1st Brigade. Going to the area, a vicious armored battle had broken out, and while the Americans did get some shots off at the opening of the fighting as the Pakistanis raced into the position to smash these forces at the salient, as it was all about speed, concentration of firepower, and surprise, the Americans reacted as best as they could, while these 2 outer range roads were providing a transportation link to the edge of the installation where the salient was jutting outward towards the mountains. These forces were heavily shelled by Pakistani artillery from their American-made 155 millimeter M198 towed howitzers, which was a great irony of this entire situation, as American weapons that had been sold to Pakistan long ago were now being utilized against them, with the addition of the 2 pairs of MiG-31Ks firing their air-to-ground anti-radiation missiles at American vehicles, as the radio sets within these vehicles served as beacons for these missiles to home in on. These KH-58s were extremely destructive on these American vehicles, as well as the 30mm nose cannons, which were used to strafe additional vehicles with in close air support operations to aid the Pakistani forces of the coalition operating on the ground. There was already a smashed outer range building here with its parking lot and smashed building, an administrative-like building, as this road here and this road here were transportation links along the northern end of the salient, as the road made it more simple for the American forces to travel, even as bunched up as they became as mixed units. These forces were no longer fighting in coherent platoon-sized formations. Although some platoons maintained their integrity, vehicles from other platoons that broke off, like so, formed 5 vehicle elements at times, or even more, and there was an attempt made to fight in 5 or more vehicle formations, like was the case here with this larger part of a rifle company's platoon mixing with 5 tanks of 2 different tank platoons, as these forces tried to form some kind of coherent fighting formations, only to be badly smashed by missile and strafing attacks, in addition to the heavy Pakistani 155mm shelling coming from the further afield artillery battalion firing at this northern salient, one of the 2 artillery battalions operating in the area, with the other further to the west, which was aided by reinforcements from Las Cruces of a Pakistani mechanized infantry battalion rushing to plug in that area and defend the artillery from being potentially overran, although the artillery was on higher ground above the valley where the leading, spearheading, reconnaissance 2 tank platoons were leading the entire salient, which were destroyed early on, as shown in the previous video. In this area, these forces, being hit from the sides, did everything they could to desperately defend their flanks as vehicles broke off and took position on a ridge line overlooking lower terrain in a valley with hills in it, where the other range road ran just below this ridge line here. There were other ridge lines and hilly terrain encapsulating this 2 by 2 mile area, and the Pakistanis themselves had to channel their forces through some different lower laying valleys, as there were ample steeper hill-like terrain all throughout this area, as this was a large desert field, essentially, which these range areas would ordinarily be utilized for test firing different missile-based weapon systems, including air defense or even rocket artillery in the form of the ATACMS missiles, which had been tested from here many times as well, which were a cruise missile fired from the American HIMARS M270 MLRS system and the HIMARS, respectively, both firing the 270 millimeter rockets, as well as could fire the ATACMS. One fired from the HIMARS, which was half of an M270 MLRS's load, with two being able to be fired from the M270 MLRS, due to it being larger than the HIMARS and could carry double what the HIMARS could in terms of payload. The ATACMS, of course, taking the place of the ordinary artillery tubes for the rockets, the 270 millimeter rockets that were ordinarily fired from these two different weapon systems. As the American armor broke off of their column on this road and took position to guard their flanks, and the forces broke up and dismounted their infantry forces as shown there from their rifle company and its vehicles, its M113s and Bradleys. These forces raced into position, only to be fired upon by Pakistani artillery strikes as imminently these came in upon showing the map, while these were already happening at the map's showing, at the initiation of this map being shown. The Pakistanis, operating their potent Al-Khalid main battle tanks as shown here, and moving and shooting throughout this entire area as these vehicle columns maneuvered into position to concentrate their heavy firepower from their potent 125 millimeter main tank guns, which could fire all of the Chinese-made ammunition for them, as again, these were originally Chinese created tanks, main battle tanks, renamed the Al-Khalid in Pakistani service and now licensed produced in Pakistan as the Al-Khalid 1. These could fire these standard Chinese anti-tank guided missiles from their bore, as well as also firing the very powerful Chinese Sabo ammunition, depleted uranium anti-tank ammunition, Frag-T shells, which were fragmentation HE shells, which were devastating against light bunkers and also clusters of enemy infantry, as well as firing standard heat ammunition, which was high explosive anti-tank ammunition, and additional others. But these tanks could shoot on the move, and indeed they did, as they had maneuvered into place. As this map is initially shown, they're already in position wherever these vehicles are. That was their position at the initiation of this map being shown. As so many things often occur in these segments of the larger battles occurring, you have these two Russian MiG-31Ks firing their KH-58 anti-radiation air-to-ground missiles, which were targeting American tanks predominantly, but also American Bradleys and even to a lesser extent infantry fighting vehicles, although it was more often than not that the priority targets were the tanks, and to the next extent as a second priority being the Bradley IFVs, as these Bradley IFVs could carry a very potent weapon aboard, being the TOW anti-tank system, carrying 2 TOW pods apiece per Bradley. These could obliterate an Al-Khalid main battle tank. And as the armored infantry forces deployed from their vehicles, exiting out the back of their Saad or M113 APCs and Viper infantry fighting vehicles, which could likewise carry a squad of troops, including even up here on this high ridge overlooking the battlefield. These forces carried ample anti-tank weapons into combat, as they were hunter-killer team-oriented forces. They were specifically built around operating anti-tank weapons for the sole purpose of protecting their own main battle tanks and mechanized infantry or armored infantry vehicles. As again, these armored battalions, whether in China, Russia, or Pakistan, are built entirely around armored warfare and destroying enemy vehicles predominantly as it related to the armored forces, the armored infantry. Such was the case as well in the American Cav rifle companies, and these American dismounted squads of this rifled company pictured would likewise engage the dismounts of the Pakistani troops in close combat, such as when this squad here made an attempt to run down the ridge here and take position on this steep hill to overlook the battlefield and fire their Javelin ATGMs at these Pakistani Al-Khalid main battle tanks. Although this supporting armored infantry dismounted squad was likewise trying to protect their armor, providing mutual support with the armor providing support for the infantry providing support for the armor to protect their tanks from these American Javelin attacks. As these dismounts, this squad and this squad, moved into position and took cover behind this somewhat steeply elevated hill, this tank moving into position, firing several shots while moving, as some tanks now stayed where they were, but were early on, these two, destroyed by M1 Abrams fire. All of this occurred as simultaneously the strafing and air-to-ground missile attacks were occurring. The artillery fire was occurring and splashing all throughout the battlefield, crippling or destroying outright American vehicles, including blasting off tank tracks or getting direct hits on tanks and severely damaging the tank from the top, or even eliminating the crew and making that tank utterly, completely combat ineffective. These forces were maneuvering at a very, very high rate of speed as it pertained to these Pakistani forces, with the Americans doing all that they could to counter these movements, although failing in rapid succession, as again, the bunching up of the American forces made them very easy to destroy, as ordinarily these armored forces would be far more widely dispersed across the battlefield, but for ease of communications, were forced to stay closer together. The Pakistani forces were fairly close together as well, but for an entirely different reason, as they were moving in as quick as they could, concentrating ample firepower against the bunched up American forces. They were maneuvering in such a way and remaining close together to concentrate all of their firepower against a largely now concentrated American force, as they were forced to respond in such a way. As their artillery support came in from their distant artillery battalion in the north, as well as air support from this pair of MiG-31Ks firing their very potent anti-radiation missiles, their KH-58s, at these vehicle targets and strafing the vehicles. The tank guns fired volley after volley of completely devastating Sabo and DU ammunition, which completely obliterated these tanks here, here, and this Bradley here, and a tank here, an M1A2, trying to stay on this road behind the somewhat relative safety of this ridge, this steep hill rather, while the artillery was able to completely hit everything, trying to keep a low silhouette behind this larger embankment. As well as over here, there was a larger embankment as indicated by this steep elevation, as shown as such. There was a large embankment here, a hill, and a hill on top of that with a fairly steep embankment, almost like a mesa. And there was a hill on top of this steeper embankment, and this being a complete ridge line of high embankment ridges right here running parallel to this outer range road down here, with this range road up here running just parallel to the one to the north of it slightly. As these forces on this higher up ridge had very good overlook of the whole battle space, not only could they radio in artillery strikes, which would go back to the FDCs of the artillery batteries and calculate the artillery strikes, but also much of this attack was even drone directed from the orbiting Chinese drones, especially the local WZ-8 high-altitude stealth drone, which had a perfect panoramic view of this entire battle space occurring in the entire northern portions of the post, as well as other areas of the post as well, as it circled this area and sent coordinates to its allies and to its own units, of course, who had the utmost advanced artificial intelligence processing systems for real-time fluid battlefield data as it related to the Chinese, and even as did the Russians as well, and with their own systems. And they shared this information with their Pakistani allies, as Pakistan was a very close ally of China. The mechanized infantry dismounted forces, having exited their vehicles over here, had moved into position and used the terrain as a shield from American fire, which had originally come in from their M1A2s and also their now dismounted infantry forces. As this entire vehicle column was being shelled and engaged by these shellings, surviving vehicles went down the ridge. But by the time they got here, they were completely and totally annihilated, this being a mixture of forces from the rifle company of the Cav Squadron along with a armored company from the Cav Squadron, which consisted of this armor here and the rest of their armor coming from this column, as this was a full platoon with an additional extra tank. And these were a half platoon of the rifle company with others of theirs, a full platoon of the rifle company here, and another half platoon up here, but there were more elements of the rifle company smashed in here, along with support vehicles, which were targeted immediately, such as fuel trucks, LMTVs, which were often used as supply trucks, as well as their armored recovery vehicles in the form of the M88s. Here was an M88 and a fuel truck beside it right here, which were targeted by Pakistani artillery and tank gun fire, as these tank guns had an extreme range, just as did the American M1A2 tank guns, which were an L44/55 copy manufactured in the United States, which originally is a gun designed and manufactured by Rheinmetall of Germany, the L44, L55 tank gun, which were basically, for all intents and purposes, the same gun in terms of the rifling and the length, other than the fact that they had different weights to them and a few other minor differences, but for all intents and purposes were pretty much the same gun, the L-44 and L-55 being both 120 millimeter rifled tank guns. The Americans manufactured the gun by license and utilized it for their M1A2 main battle tanks, as well as the M1A1. These forces, mere minutes into this engagement, had by now, on the American side, lost an ample number of total vehicles, not only to Pakistani artillery fire, as here, and also indicated by the artillery fire markers for incoming shells, but also had lost an ample number of vehicles to the Russian close air support provided by these two pairs of MiG-31Ks coming in and firing their air-to-ground missiles and strafing these American tanks and other vehicles, such as Bradleys and even a few M113s, such as here and here. The Pakistani artillery fire completely devastated dismounted infantry, as shown here by this arrow encapsulated in orange, meaning they were totally destroyed. These forces here, behind this steep embankment of this hill, were totally destroyed by Pakistani artillery fire. And this tank was engaged by Pakistani artillery fire, but survived, although it was fairly moderately damaged as those shells smashed relatively close by. This movement was engaged and two were lost, although it wasn't completely encapsulated in orange, meaning they didn't completely all perish. But by the time they reached here, they were being heavily engaged not only by the strafing attacks of the Russian air power, but also being engaged by Pakistani IFVs firing from over a mile away, and also tank guns as well as 125 millimeter shells impacted in this area. There was a Frag T shell fired to purposely hit the infantry forces trying to gather behind the relative safety, I should say, of their armor, of their M1A2s. Although these two were destroyed outright, they were also being engaged by Pakistani forces, as indicated by the orange, but they were completely destroyed by these air-to-ground anti-radiation KH-58 missiles, as were these three main battle tanks here. Again, this Bradley here and these M113s here, three of them completely destroyed by air-to-ground missiles, as well as strafing attacks, and these two M1A2s destroyed by air-to-ground KH-58 missiles, and here. This one destroyed by tank shells, and these two surviving tanks of this platoon, this coherent tank platoon here, this full platoon of 4 tanks, advanced this way down this lower part of the whole ridge line, and were engaged by the time they reached the road and destroyed by these larger Pakistani tank and infantry forces, as indicated by this big arrow, which includes all of these forces here, as this indicates earlier movements of this dismounted squad to here, along with this tank, and this tank, all comprised this larger arrow moving here, as they engaged all from here all the way to the road itself. As they engaged these two surviving Abrams tanks, there was a shootout between the tanks themselves and each other, but the Abrams did not prevail and were completely destroyed, as these tanks were firing while on the move and very difficult to hit by the Abrams tanks, although the Abrams tanks could lock onto a target fairly effectively and track them. The movement was completely difficult with the addition of passive protection measures utilized by these Al-Khalid main battle tanks. And the Al-Khalids also had ERA kits and applique armor installed on them, so when the shells impacted very close to them, they did cause some damage but did not completely destroy these Al-Khalids. The infantry forces lost a few KIAs, however, to the exchange of fire going on here. Now here, this dismounted squad, again, was trying to fight this dismounted squad over control of this fairly steep hill right here, which overlooked the Pakistani positions now evolving across the battlefield. This was a headquarters element back here with a M88 American-made armored recovery vehicle purchased by Pakistan during the Cold War, a field truck, some Chinese MRAPs, VP-11s, and Chinese-made Shangji trucks as part of this headquarters element, with their troops comprising a semicircle in order to protect these forces should they be attacked by American infantry or anything else should they make it that far. But again, their armored forces and their armored infantry were very heavily anti-tank oriented forces and were deployed in this battle in such a way to where they prevented American dismounted rifle company infantry from getting anywhere near their support assets or being able to destroy any of the Al-Khalids in battle as far as their Javelin anti-tank missiles were concerned, boasted by these rifle company forces. A vicious close quarters battle broke out upon that hill, but the Pakistanis completely finished off this American squad and maintained control of the hill. These two tanks that tried to move up were destroyed by Pakistani fire from their Al-Khalid main battle tanks, as well as this tank, having had been taken some minor damage from the Russian strafing, had moved ahead only to be destroyed by Al-Khalid main battle tank fire as well. And these infantry forces destroyed by the Pakistani artillery shelling. Moving over here, the artillery splashing here destroyed these infantry forces as well and severely damaged these vehicles that weren't destroyed by the Russian strafing or air-to-ground missile attacks. And this surviving dismounted infantry force tried to run down the ridge line and take cover between this steep hill embankment here and building at the same time as these forces that had earlier moved here at the beginning of the battle and were being engaged, who hugged this terrain by taking the prone position behind this terrain, and they used the terrain to their best advantage as cover and some concealment to hide behind. They advanced as they fired while on the move at these American forces, in addition to receiving ample fire support from the main battle tanks of the two Pakistani tank companies operating in the area, as well as their own armored infantry companies, being two on this map, elements of two different armored infantry companies, firing their potent 30-millimeter autocannon with explosive ammunition at these dismounted infantry forces, as well as at lighter American armored vehicles such as the American M113s trying to maneuver across the battlefield, as well as Bradleys. The turret gunners firing their PK-16 heavy 12.7-millimeter machine guns on the Saad or the M113 APCs utilized were doing severe damage of their own, as these heavy machine guns likewise had a very long range advantage and could definitely exceed 1 mile in their total range capabilities. And all of this concentrated firepower from all of these Pakistani forces, as well as their high positions and being able to fire down at forces and radio in very precise artillery strikes anywhere they could see, was causing tremendous damage extremely rapidly to these American forces. And yes, the Americans likewise tried to use the terrain to their advantage, such as trying to get behind these higher, steeper embankments along the roads here, but they were still spotted by the Chinese ISR assets in the area, including satellite as well, from much higher up, and were likewise had their coordinates radioed in to their Pakistani allies for artillery strikes from the Pakistani artillery battalion operating miles north of this area to fire their 155-millimeter howitzer shells at these columns of slinking American vehicles as they moved in a caterpillar-like motion to stay within close communication so their runners could move between commanders of these different companies that were trying to stay together and relay orders or vital information from other commanders, ostensibly battalion commanders, although this was becoming increasingly difficult as the battalions began to break up into companies, and the companies had a hard time keeping control over their platoons anywhere combat broke out, as, again, these forces were ostensibly forced to become reactionary against attackers and had to respond in a reactionary sort of way. And in doing so, they became mixed units even more, even at the platoon levels, and became mixed with other platoons as these forces all attempted to make a general response to the attacking Pakistani forces. Now, as the surviving battle tanks of this group here already being engaged by Pakistani artillery, with 2 being destroyed by tank gun fire as well as a Concourse missile fired from an IFV of the Pakistani forces attacking the area. These forces, these 3 tanks here, moved along this line of advance to get closer to better engage the Pakistani forces, although by this point, this column of Pakistani Al-Khalid tanks was already firing from far back here at American forces, as well as all the other tanks firing all throughout the battlefield, locking onto their American targets and firing with their ballistic computers, laser rangefinders, and fire control systems, which were Chinese-made and very advanced. These forces columns split up into 2, and the tanks that made it here were being engaged already by the time they made it here and here, as were all these tanks trying to essentially protect their advance into the area by already stopping here, here, and here, and firing. It was sort of like a leapfrog motion, similar to the bounding and covering of American or enemy infantry forces, as these tanks took cover while these tanks moved ahead, and then these tanks moved, as indicated here, and these mechanized infantry forces were doing the same. They bounded here, took cover, they bounded here, and took cover. As these tanks moved here, they were being engaged by these tanks now here, 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 and here, and were destroyed by the Al-Khalid main battle tanks, allowing the forces that went this way, the part of the column that broke up this way, to advance further across the battlefield, although it continued to take fire from any surviving American forces, the fire being relatively light by this point, as this column was totally destroyed. Again, all these things were happening simultaneously throughout this small map segment, so covering them in a coherent order is difficult, but covering them from west to east, generally, this is what happened, all occurring simultaneously, but covered from west to east. And then finally, as that had wrapped up, this column of vehicles continued to advance to catch up to their dismounted infantry squads, which had taken cover here early on and were being engaged at the time by American armor firing from here. But again, these forces didn't last very long, and as they advanced here earlier, were destroyed by these forces here again. And this infantry dismounted squad moved here in order to fire their Alcaton and Chinese-made HJ-08s, their Alcatons being Spanish-made anti-armor rockets, which had a very advanced aiming system, although they weren't wire or infrared guided or anything like that. They had a laser rangefinder and ballistic computer within their sighting system, and they fired a very potent anti-armor unguided rocket, which was aimed with their aiming system. It was a 100 millimeter tandem charged anti-tank rocket, which was bigger than the 84 millimeter recoilless shell fired by the American AT-4. And this Spanish-made anti-tank rocket, which was aimed but unguided, could destroy 700 millimeters of RHA, making it capable of eliminating any main battle tank on the modern battlefield, or at least any battle tank that didn't have RHA or applique armor kits added to it. We're just talking about the ordinary tank armor. And the American AT-4 could only penetrate 400 millimeters of RHA. Still quite powerful, but not anywhere near as strong as the Spanish-made Alcaton. Now, the Chinese HJ-08 was a bona fide anti-tank missile, which was guided and could destroy, it was wire-guided and could destroy its target. And it would hit typically from a angle to where it went down into the top of the tank. Very destructive. And the Pakistanis had bought them by the boatload. Many thousands of these HJ-08s, as well as the same number of Alcatons, roughly, as these were bulked up on over the years. As this column here was slinking along, it was hit by ample artillery strikes, as indicated here, but also here, and there was no place to hide for them. As you can see, this arrow is completely encapsulated in orange, which means all of these vehicles are ultimately destroyed by the huge number of artillery fire, as well as even tank shell fire that could fly over areas where they weren't completely blocked by steep elevated hills, such as like here and throughout this area here once they made it into the area. As again, they had no way to reverse their column, and they were pretty much stuck where they were and completely hit by artillery and some tank shells like right here, in conjunction with artillery, which also was hitting this column right here and badly damaging a lot of the vehicles within it. Although the tanks, many of them survived and were able to limp into combat, although they took damage, because there were some tanks that were completely immobilized by having their tracks completely blown off, and also other damage occurring to the backs of the tanks or on top of them if they were directly hit on top by a artillery shell of a 155 size, which did incredible damage. But the tank armor was still incredibly strong when compared to the armor of an M113 or even a Bradley. The tanks were a bit more survivable from artillery than were these lighter armored vehicles, especially the soft skin vehicles, which didn't even stand a chance, like the support vehicles like the LMTV trucks or the fuel trucks or the armored recovery vehicles or the MRAPs, so on and so forth. They were completely annihilated by all of the artillery strikes coming in. As fire mission after fire mission was radioed in by the Pakistanis' own armored infantry dismounts, or vehicle-based forces, or even from the Chinese ISR assets relaying the data directly to the Pakistani command as well as their artillery forces, their FDCs. This made responses to the modern fluid battlefield far faster than was ever before the case, especially for the Pakistani army. The Pakistani losses, however, as the Americans did get off some shots and were able to slightly maneuver in some cases, the Pakistani losses were a few of their Saad APCs with the turret gunner and also driver inside, although the squads by this point were largely dismounted, as is the case throughout this segment of the larger battle map. And the American M1 Abrams tanks did destroy two Al-Khalid main battle tanks here and here. These were totally destroyed. Others were engaged and even damaged, but weren't completely destroyed. and were definitely able to be repaired, while the Americans lost all of their armor, as well as all of their rifle company here, losing a total of 4 companies at this battle, when including the rifle company and 3 tank companies involved. This was a savage battle at the northern end of the salient, and a heavy price was paid by the defenders for their attempted breakout and their concentration and mixing of forces. Although this was done for shortening communication lines, it actually hurt their forces even more and didn't aid them in this case. And the reason for such being that as their forces bunched up and became mixed, they became reactionary forces in the sense that they weren't operating under a coordinated manner as it related to their forces, making it difficult to coordinate any type of counterattacks. Thus, they had to come up with things on the fly, so to speak, as far as being reactionary. They had to try their best to come up with maneuvers on the fly, and different platoons couldn't coordinate well with other platoons throughout the battlefield, as a platoon here mixed with another platoon couldn't coordinate with a platoon on the opposite end 2 miles away on the battlefield, and everything in between. Only forces operating within immediate earshot of each other could rapidly coordinate some kind of attack, and even so, such an effort was doomed from the start, because these forces had very, very adequate communications and coordination, as well as very potent close air support and artillery support, superiority in armored forces, communication, allies, very powerful allies, and ISR capabilities, being able to know where all of these forces were, where exactly they were moving, how they were moving, as far as if they were moving in any coherent type of order, and seeing beyond the line of contact to be able to shell forces trying to push their way into the forward point of the entire salient. But they were failing in this effort as they were heavily bombarded by Pakistani artillery fire, Russian air attack from the close air support, as well as Pakistani tank fire as the 125 millimeter main tank guns, and even the anti-tank guided missiles fired from the tank guns, or the Concourse fired from their Viper IFVs, or the HJ-08s fired from their dismounted infantry, and even the Alcatel to a lesser extent, had quite a range to them and could really reach out and touch their forces. Therefore, the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division was doomed to utter failure, as their forces were completely cut off and piecemeal destroyed on the battlefield, as they lacked the communications, the ability to coordinate effectively, the means by which to maneuver effectively on the modern battlefield and carry out an assault that would actually badly damage the enemy enough to be able to push them back and widen out the salient even more, of which they were unable to do, as again they became bunched up, mixed units that could only fight in a reactionary manner, as they totally lacked communications due to the electronic warfare jamming of their radios, due to the anti-satellite and cyber attacks, eliminating all their military satellites and ISR capabilities, in addition to the cyber attack removing the military networks that they depended on, such as their most recent iteration of their own combat data link-like system, the Blue Force trackers, which since the early 2000s had come a long way, all of that was gone. And now these were modern vehicles operating on 19th century principles, meaning foot runners had to carry messages and orders between vehicles, making it impossible to adequately coordinate anything across the entire line of contact, making only very small scale level localized attacks the only possibility by which that battles could be conducted against a far superior enemy with far superior weapons in terms of quantity and quality, far superior ISR capabilities, and far superior artificial intelligence as in terms of what the Chinese possessed and even the Russians, by which to process data on the modern fluid battlefield, from which that data could be utilized to make the forces far more rapid and effective than was ever before the case. And this included even eliminating friendly fire possibilities, taking that possibility almost to zero, making it possible to better coordinate their forces against the Americans, who are now operating in a very haphazard manner, not out of choice, obviously, but out of necessity, as there was no other way by which to coordinate their forces. Essentially, the Americans were experienced what the Iraqis experienced within the first Gulf War, but worse in many ways. By 15 minutes into the second hour, or a quarter after 1 a.m., this battle, which began 45 minutes in, as it pertained to the entire salient battle, was rapidly coming to an end. As any Americans that were wounded or somehow survived this engagement were rounded up as POWs and taken into captivity by the Pakistani forces. These regular army forces of Pakistan, as well as even the Chinese PLA and the Russian army, treated the American POWs with a measure of hospitality, caring for the wounded and feeding them adequately and treating them decently. Although they bended the Geneva Conventions a little bit, they didn't outright abuse these prisoners of war. Although the same couldn't be said as it related to the paramilitary forces involved throughout the invasion, especially the PAP and the Iranian IRGC, who fought by their own codes of conduct and rules. The regular military forces did their best to be as humanitarian as was conceivably possible as per their codes of conduct and their cultural beliefs. As the salient battle was rapidly coming to an end, the brigade, the 1st Brigade of the 1st AD, was being completely annihilated and now was beginning to be encircled by the forces of the Pakistani army, who would encircle the salient, or what remained of it, before punching through after clearing the area to clear the rest of the installation. And while they would rapidly smash their way into the installation, break into it, they would engage smaller company-sized elements throughout the installation into the 2nd and 3rd hours of the invasion, before finishing the clearance of the installation by encountering these rear detachment elements of other tenon units, as well as isolated small pockets of American forces that within the first 2 hours of the entire invasion had been smashed and cut off from their former main battalions and companies, and would be surrounded and eliminated in isolated pockets throughout the installation. which would be a fairly simple task considering the larger battalions had by this point been completely withered away to almost nothing. In the next installment of this documentary series, the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion and their Spec Ops operation in the mountains of New Mexico in the Rockies to capture a high-value target or eliminate a high-value target, and also the core of his militia, will be gone over in the next video of this series, of this sub-series of this larger documentary, followed by the battle that erupted in Deming, which was an important battle as this was undertaken to clear any possibility of armed resistance adjacent to the major important highway system. All of this as into hour number 2, upon crossing the border, the heaviest force within the 14th Group Army of the PLA, the 144th Armored Division, was by now getting closer and closer as it was on windy mountain roads approaching the interstate I-10 as it had crossed over through the desert and began to reach the mountainous foothills of the Rockies, was about to reach and cross the Rio Grande River and enter Las Cruces before moving up I-25, not only to secure it formally, but also to hold it and lead the entire external invasion prong as the rest of the 14th Group Army, now fighting in the city of El Paso, as well as in the southern portions of the installation itself, and to aid the Pakistani Trojan forces, would form up on I-10 and travel north to fall in behind the 144th Armored Division, as well as the 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade doing the same upon having cleared the areas adjacent to I-10 as far as the western flanks of this invasion were concerned, before falling in on I-10 and getting behind the 14th Group Army, which would by that point be moving out of the battle space and further north, leaving the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division as the occupation forces for the entire El Paso Fort Bliss area itself. This will be continued in the next video.